What's up, everybody? Welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video, we're going to take a look at passwordless authentication. So what is passwordless authentication? Well, all it really means is you're pretty much going to allow the users of your application to log into your app without needing a password. And so the flow basically works a little something like this. They will pretty much create an account in your application using nothing more than their email address. Of course, they can also insert their name and different information about them, but they're not actually going to be providing a password. Rather, the only thing that they're going to pretty much give you is an email address and then some other sort of metadata about themselves. Then when they want to log in, on the login form, instead of having like an input for the password, you're only going to have one input for the actual email address. They insert the email address that they use to kind of create their account. Then they're going to get an email sent from your system to the email that they've actually entered. If they actually have access to that email, assuming that it is in fact their email, they can then click on the link that was sent to them, and then that link will redirect them back to the application, and at that point they'll be authenticated. With all of that introduction out of the way, let's actually jump into the code and see how this can actually be done. As always, if you'd like to follow along, you can find the starter files down in the description box below. So let's get into it. Okay, so let's take a look at the code that we have so far. So right here, we're pretty much looking at the root of the application, and as you can see, we have the server.js file, which is the one that I currently have open right now. And of course, there's nothing here just yet, but this is where we're pretty much going to be writing all of our backend code for the sake of this little tutorial. And then finally, we have the client folder where our React application lives. This is pretty much where the user will be able to create an account, as well as actually log into their account, and then also see sort of one private page that they can actually only see if they have in fact logged in using our authentication system. So let's actually start writing some code. Okay, so the first thing that we're doing here is just pretty much importing just a couple of things that we're going to be using for this application. So again, if you've already downloaded the starter files, you already have all this installed, so you can just go ahead and run yarn or npmi, and it's all going to be there for you, waiting to get used. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm just importing the .env package so that I can actually use .env files, because I am actually going to be using AWS. So in my .env file, I'm actually hiding my actual sort of keys that I need to actually connect to my AWS account, which is why I'm putting that into the .env file. I don't want to actually push it up to GitHub, and therefore we're using the .env package so that I can actually read values out of my .env file. Finally, now we're going to actually go ahead and install Express, create an app object off of the Express function call. We're going to go ahead and import AWS, import body parser, we're going to import UID, and then finally we're going to import the JWT library so that we can actually go ahead and send them tokens once they've effectively and successfully logged into the application. Okay, so here we're just pretty much setting up the body parser middleware so that we can actually go ahead and read the bodies, nothing really to it. Okay, so here we're pretty much starting to set up a few more interesting things. So number one, we're actually setting up the AWS connection. So again, we're creating this config object, which is going to go to the US East region, and then just using my secret access key and my access key ID, which again, I'm simply reading out of my .env file. So if you are going to create your own .env file, you're going to want to have something called secret access key and access key ID, assuming that you do plan on using AWS to send the emails. If you want to use something else, then none of this is going to be relevant to you. Here, we are going to be sort of simulating our database. Of course, if you'd be doing this with a real-life application, you wouldn't just be storing things in memory. But for the sake of this tutorial, I figured there's no need to actually go ahead and make this more complex and use a real database. So I have one array that's going to keep track of the actual accounts that the system has in general, and then another one is going to keep track of login attempts, which I'm going to, once we actually start getting into the flow of trying to log in, we'll see how login attempts actually gets used. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and create an instance of the SES module, which is what we're going to be using to actually go ahead and send the email. So we pretty much take this config object, pass it into the AWS SES constructor. We get back the SES, which pretty much stands for Simple Email System. And that's what we're actually going to use to go ahead and send the emails. Okay, so here we actually have the function that we're going to be using. This is the function that's called send email. This is going to actually take in an email. This is going to be the one that we're trying to send the email to. In other words, who are we sending the email out to? This is the email address. This is the sort of destination email. Then we're actually sending in the UID. And as you can see, the UID is getting used right over here. And pretty much all we're doing is we're just sending this body that's going to include a sort of URL. Of course, right now, if we're just in development mode, which is why we can just go to localhost 3000. And so pretty much in our client-side application, we're going to have an actual route called /verify/SomeID, which is what the user will get sent to when they actually go ahead and click on the link that they find on that email. And then that actual route will then go ahead and grab that UID out and then send it back to the server to kind of go ahead and validate them. And once again, once we actually start building up the actual Express portion of this application, all this is going to start making a little bit more sense. And then finally, right over here within the send email function, we're actually calling the SES module, calling it send email function, passing in these params that we've just built up over here. And then we just have the simple callback if an error, we're going to log the error. Otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and log the response to make sure that it actually did in fact get sent correctly. Okay, so here's actually now the first one of the routes within our Express application. As you can see, we're making a simple post request to /signup. And all we're doing is we're pretty much just going to expect the user to kind of send us an email address, which we will then push into the accounts array. So again, in a real life scenario, you'd actually go ahead and store this email address in with a lot more information than just email address. In other words, you're going to sort of take an entire account object, which might include the person's name, their age, and whatever else you might want to know about them, including their email address, and actually go ahead and store this into the database proper. But again, for the sake of this tutorial, it's enough to just kind of go ahead and put this in to this local array called accounts, and all we're just pretty much storing is just going to be the email address. Finally, we just send back a status code of 200, and then the message will be success true, and that's all that this endpoint is doing. Okay, so here we basically have an endpoint called identify. So we're pretty much going to be making a post request to /identify. This endpoint is going to get used whenever the user actually tries to log in. So when the client-side application is going to be a form that's going to be the login form, they're going to be prompted to go ahead and enter just their email address. And then when they do that, they're going to make a post request to this particular endpoint right over here. What we're going to do is we're going to take that email address, do a find over our accounts array to see if this email does in fact exist. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build up an UID. Finally, we're going to take both the email that we just found, again, assuming that we did in fact find it, because if they never actually created an account with us, if they're not a user within our system, then we're never going to find the email address, which is why the email never gets to them, which is why it's secure. But assuming we do in fact find this email address, what we're going to do is we're going to then take this email that we found, the UID that we just created, passing into the login attempts array. So again, remember up here we have an array for accounts, and then another one for login attempts. So we're going to go ahead and pass that object in, one key with email, one key with the ID. We're then going to go ahead and send them an email. So again, only to the email that we have found over here. So we're not actually sending an email to direct.by to that email, because that would be silly, because then anybody can log in. The idea is we have to make sure that we actually send it to the email that does in fact exist within our system. So therefore, we're going to take the email that they pass into us. We're going to do a find within our accounts array, find the email that matches, and then that's the one that we then go ahead and send the email to, along with the ID that we've just created. And then pretty much no matter what, we're always going to go back and say res the status to 200, because of course we don't want to kind of give the user any indication of whether or not the email is in fact on its way, because we don't want to sort of give a potential malicious user any validation of whether or not the account does in fact exist or doesn't exist, which is why we just make it a blanket statement that in all instances, whether or not we actually find the email, we're always just going to go ahead and say success true. Therefore, they don't get any validation of whether or not the email does in fact exist if they're just trying to be malicious and find accounts within our system. Okay, and finally we have this post request going to the /verify URL. So this endpoint gets used when basically the user will have the email. Right? In other words, in their email, there's going to be a link that they're going to click on. That link will then take them to some sort of page within the actual client-side application. That page within the client-side application is going to pull the ID out of the URL and take that ID and make a post request down to the /verify URL or endpoint rather, and take that ID and send it to the actual post request. What we're then going to do with that ID is we're going to do a find over our login attempts array, and we're going to go ahead and see if a login attempt with this ID does in fact exist, right? If it does, then what we're going to do is we're going to be pulling the account out of that particular login attempt, and then we're just going to do a simple check over here. If account, that means that this person has in fact existed within our system over here. They did in fact try to log in. It isn't, and they are who they say they are. At this point, we've pretty much verified that it's them. And now we can actually go ahead and build up a token for them, send them that token, and now they're successfully logged in. Otherwise, if we don't actually find an account, then we don't really quite know what happened, but they sure enough can obviously not get verified. They're not verified, they're not authorized. Therefore, we're just going to go ahead and send back a simple 401. And by the way, if you're not entirely familiar with how JSON Web Tokens work, I do actually have a video dedicated just to JSON Web Tokens. You can find a link to that down in the description box below. Okay, so now the last thing we want to do is just tell the server to listen on port 1337, and then when the server starts up and running, we're going to say that the server is running on the port of LEET. Okay, so now we're in so we have one terminal open to the actual root of the application. All we're going to do is say node server.js, and we see that the server is running on LEET, so now we know that the actual backend code is complete. We can now go ahead and move on to the actual client-side code. So as you can see, within the client-side code, we have this folder called routes, right? And we also have the app.js. So the app.js already has all the sort of React Router boilerplate set up. That we have the signup route, the login route. We also have our private route, and then we also have the route for verifying with the actual ID. So all that's kind of set up, and these are all sort of routing back to these routes that we have here within our routes folder. But all of these files are actually empty, so it's going to be our job to kind of walk through this together now and kind of fill it up to kind of get the whole application to actually work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead to the sign up route, and we're going to fill this in with the necessary code to kind of build the sign up form. So let's do that now. Okay, so as you can see, we are currently in the sign up route, the sign up file within the routes folder. And so very simply what we're doing is we're pretty much building a simple React component, pulling in React, pulling in the useState hook from React, also pulling in Immer, which by the way, if you missed my video on Immer, you can find a link to that down in the description box below, pulling in Axios, and here we're pretty much just building a simple component. And all it's doing is it's initializing the account state. So we're pretty much going to be asking the user for username and email. We're not actually doing anything with the username in this example, but I simply wanted to show that you can, of course, ask the user for any other information that you want within the regular sign-up flow. The only difference is where normally you'd also be asking them for a password. In this case, there's no need to ask them for a password. That's the only reason why I've actually included username. We are actually not doing anything with it in this particular tutorial. And then here in the JSX, you can see we're building up a simple form where we have the H1 with the sort of header of what this form is about. We've got the two inputs, and then we've actually got the button that calls the create account function. And then within the create account function, we're very simply just going to go ahead and make a post request to the sign up route, passing the account details. And then once that succeeds, we're just going to go ahead and push them to the actual login screen. So now that we have to go to the login screen, let's actually go ahead and fill in the login screen with the necessary code. Okay, so here we actually have the code necessary for the login screen. And as you can see, it's very straightforward. All we're doing is pretty much importing React, the useState hook. We are also importing Axios. Finally, we're just building a simple component called login, which is going to be initializing 2 bits of state. One of them is going to be the actual email that's going to be bound to the email input. So again, the only thing that we need the user to actually enter in the login screen is just going to be the email address. And then we're just going to have a basic Boolean of keeping track of whether or not the email has in fact been sent, because we kind of want to just have a simple message saying that an email with the magic link is on its way. And again, crucially, it's important to remember that we're going to be showing this email this message whether or not the email is actually on its way, because of course for malicious users we don't want them to kind of get any validation of whether an email does in fact exist in the system. Therefore, no matter what, every single time somebody submits on this form, they're always going to see a message saying an email with a magic link is on its way, even though an email may not in fact be on its way. So here in the JSX, we're just pretty much going to go ahead and build up this form. Assuming that the email hasn't been sent yet, we go ahead and build up this form where they're just going to type in their email address. Then on click, they click the get link function, which just makes the post request to /identify, passing in the email address. Once that resolves, we just go ahead and say set email sent to true. At this point, we're going to come into this if check over here saying that we have an H1 with an email with a magic link is on its way. So now that that's done, now what's going to be happening is at this point an email will be sent to a user, and when they click on that particular link, they're then going to get brought to a URL called /verify. So if you actually look at the app.js, you'll see that we have a path called /verify/uid, which is rendering a component called email target. So let's go ahead and fill up the necessary code to make the email target file actually work. Okay, so the email target itself is also not too complicated. As you can see, we're pulling in React, we're pulling in the useEffect hook as well as the useState hook. We're then pulling in the redirect component from React Router DOM. We're soon going to see why that's important. And then finally, we go ahead and we actually build the email target component. The only thing that it's really doing as far as state is concerned is it's just defining a piece of state called login state. And then we actually come to the useEffect hook. So within the useEffect hook, this is where we're actually going to go ahead and make the post request to /verify. And then what we're doing is we're going to go ahead and send in the ID. So as you remember, the ID, the actual UID, the sort of unique identifier that's going to identify this particular person that got put into the link within the email address, that is now going to get pulled out of the URL, and we're going to go ahead and send it to the post request. And as you can see, we're doing that right over here by saying props.mesh.params.uid. We're going to go and grab the UID out of the URL and then send it down to the actual verifying post request that sits on the server. So now what's going to happen is here is we're going to go ahead and say if the status code is of what we get back from this particular request, if the response has a status code of 200, at that point you know that the user has successfully logged in which case we're going to go ahead and set the local storage with a token of their particular token, and then we're going to actually go ahead and say set login state is equal to success. Otherwise, we're just going to go ahead and say that the login state is just going to be equal to an empty string. Now, the reason why this is important is because here in the actual body, what we're doing is we're pretty much saying that if the login state is actually equal to success, we're then going to go ahead and redirect them back to the simple root URL, because at the root URL, that's where the private page actually is. So again, if they want to actually get to the private page, they have to go to the root URL. If you're not logged in when you go to the private page, you're then going to get sent back to the actual login screen. But if you are correctly logged in, then you can just go ahead and see this page. But when you actually go through the flow of actually clicking on your email address, getting sent to the verifying page, the verify page is actually able to successfully take your ID, send it down to the server, and successfully logging you in. At that point, once that flow is sort of done, we kind of want to send you back to the private page, which sits at the root URL. Otherwise, if this for some reason didn't work, let's say you actually get back a 401 or something went wrong on the server, we're just going to go ahead and say a simple something went wrong message. Of course, if you actually want to be more specific with what actually went wrong, you can choose to do that right over here. Okay, so now that we actually have the email target done, so that means that now the user can actually successfully log in, we now actually have to give them something to see, assuming that they've actually successfully logged in, right? Because we said that if the login state is equal to success, they're going to get sent to the root URL where the private page actually lives, which means we now have to actually go to the private page file and actually go ahead and fill it up with something. And so it turns out this is actually going to be the simplest of them all. All we're really doing is just going to kind of show them a simple message that if you're seeing this, then you've logged in successfully. Now that pretty much does it for all the code. We're now finally ready to actually go ahead and test it to see if it actually works, to see if we can actually make a user log in without actually using a password. So let's see if it works. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we are in the tab that is open to the root of the project, which is where the backend code lives. We're going to go ahead and say node server.js. We're then going to go to the other tab that's pointing to the client folder. So that's going to be pretty much in the same place as before, except one level further, actually going into the client folder. Here we're going to go ahead and say yarn start. That's going to kind of bring up the client-side application. They both have to be running at the same time. Okay, so as you can see, the first thing that we're actually getting met with is going to be the actual login screen. Right now, the reason why that's happening is because when we actually try to go to the root URL, as you can see, we immediately get sent back to the login screen because we're not currently logged in. And the root URL is where the private page sort of lives, and the private page will pretty much just send you back to the login page if you're not correctly logged in. Let's actually go ahead and log in. The problem is, of course, that as of right now, we don't actually have an account at the system. Let's go ahead and first create an account. So in order to do that, we're going to go to the /signup URL. We're going to say that our username is Real Tough Guy. Again, we're not really using that, but we might as well just fill it in because why not? But the most important part is we're actually going to say that our email address is going to be realtoughguy@gmail.com. Let's go ahead and create that account. Now we can come back to the login screen. We can go ahead and say that we want to log in as Real Tough Guy. We're going to get a link. It now tells us that an email with a magic link is on its way. And then any minute we should actually have an email come to our email address. And as you can see, we now do in fact have an email with the sort of subject line of magic link. And then we go ahead and we click on this particular link. As you can see, we are in fact getting the message that if you're seeing this, then you've logged in successfully. And we pretty much now created an authentication flow that does not rely on any passwords, but rather just kind of sends a magic link. User clicks on that link, and then they can just log in with just using their email address. Well, that does it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week in another video.
Perfect.